As part of our series on global health, we are delighted to have back on this small little stage a big star, Dr. Robert Klitzman. I know some of you were here for his earlier discussions in this series, the first which focused on Ebola and providing health care to the global poor in times of crisis, and the other was on medical tourism. Both fascinating discussions. Today we're turning the tables because I will be interviewing Bob. This time, the focus is on his recently published book entitled The Ethics Police: The Struggle to Make Human Research Safe. In it, he writes about medical research involving human participants. Before we go into the meat of the discussion, in the introduction to your book, you talked a lot about why you particularly were interested in this topic, and I wondered if you would share with us your personal story.
Yes, so when my father was sick, before he died, he was in the hospital, he got sick. He had leukemia, which is due to rising numbers of white blood cells in the body. And the doctor basically said there's no effective treatment. We could just let nature take its course, or we can do a little bit of an experiment and have this chemotherapy that we could try, and there's a 50% chance that he might live for 3 to 18 months. What do you want to do? And my father didn't know what to do. He was a realist. My mother said, let's take nature, let nature take its course. We all know the horrors of chemotherapy. And I had recently finished my medical training, and I was filled with hope for science, and had seen doctors do great things and scientists do great things and believed in science, and I thought we should go ahead and do the chemotherapy. And he did it, and I think a little part because I urged, or I thought it might have affected him. And then 3 months to almost to the day he died. And the last 3 months were terrible. He was nauseous most of the time, et cetera. And so that haunted me, has continued to haunt me, because did I play a part in that? Did I push him to do this chemotherapy as an experiment? And I should say, when he died, the doctor came up to me and said, well, he said, the experiment worked, but the patient died. That his blood cell counts actually went back to normal, so the experiment worked, but the patient died. And I was horrified by that, and I felt that we didn't, or at least I didn't really understand the choices, and yet I do research, so I routinely have people enter experiments, and yet I'd never really seen how hard it is for someone being asked to be in an experiment where you don't know what the outcome is, to do that. And so I began to get interested in what the experience is like for patients who have to be in experiments, and then are we minding the story sufficiently? And we read about drug company scandals, we read about scandals that Facebook has been doing research on us, there are questions with Ebola, so there are lots of questions about what experiment should be done on us. And I began to realize that my way of thinking about it, or the way I'd been trained in medicine, was different from what the experience of patients and family members were, and so I thought it was worth trying to understand this. And the more I looked into it, the more I saw that no one really understood it. We've set up something called research ethics committees, or institutional review boards, or IRBs in this country, to decide what research is ethical enough, but there had been no study looking at different institutions really about how they make decisions. And there have been problems because there have been studies that they approve that later run into problems. There was an article in the New York Times about a study at University of Minnesota, for instance. Dan Markinson, it was a patient at the University of Minnesota with schizophrenia. His doctor, he went to the hospital, was given a doctor. The doctor was doing an experiment, told Dan that he should be in the experiment. Dan couldn't leave the hospital, so we thought he had to be in the experiment. AstraZeneca was paying the doctor per patient, about $18,000 per patient entered into the study. They were low on patients, and Dan killed himself, and it's a long story. But again, showing how in some cases things are done that shouldn't be done.
But are there then ethical standards that guide research today? I
Yes.
know after the Tuskegee study
Yes.
on the African American population that had syphilis, they instituted these IRBs.
Yes.
So maybe you could talk a
Yes.
little about that.
Research ethics are fairly new because research and medical research didn't exist really in the past. So when Hippocrates wrote the Hippocratic Oath, there are important parts of that we still live by. Hippocrates said, whatever I hear in the house of a patient, I will keep to myself. I won't, I will protect patient confidentiality. So those things we continue. But medical research as we now know it didn't exist then. There weren't clinical trials, et cetera. So it's a fairly new phenomenon. So it first came to attention, and guidelines were first developed because of the Nazis. So during the Holocaust, the Nazis conducted experiments on people in concentration camps. They wanted to find out, for instance, how long people could survive in the cold before they died, which the Nazis wanted to know because they had a lot of soldiers on the front. So they took people in concentration camps and put them in the cold and saw how long it took for them to die. So as a result of that, the Nuremberg Tribunal was held and came up with a set of guidelines for what needed to be done in terms of ethics for research. Most importantly, there should be complete informed consent. The problem is that we in this country didn't follow that. So through 1974, as you say, there was the Tuskegee syphilis study. And this was started before World War II, when there was no treatment for syphilis effective. And the US government, and supported by major institutions, decided to follow a group of African American men, mostly who were semi-illiterate, with syphilis to see what the natural course of the disease would be in their body, how it would slowly take over their brain, et cetera. The problem is that after World War II, penicillin became available as a definitive treatment. And the doctors and the hospitals, I think Hopkins and there were some other major institutions, I'm not sure which ones, thought that we should not tell the men that there was now effective treatment for their syphilis because it would destroy the experiment. If we told them there was effective treatment and gave it to them, that'd be the end of the experiment and we wouldn't get the answer, so we shouldn't tell them. Again, major moral problem. But as a result of that, in 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act that said that we should set up local institutional review boards or research ethics committees to oversee what science does. And they should be local, to reflect local community values. And we now have 5,000 of these committees. And they operate basically behind closed doors, so no one really knows how they make decisions. When I started to interview researchers about them, I said, what do you think of these committees? They all said they have tremendous power. And when I interviewed the committees, I said, do you think you have power? They said, we don't have any power, we're just following the regulations. But they do have quite a bit of power in ways that I could talk about. And as I said, the problem is that there are, on the one hand, there are studies they approve that then run into problems. And there are studies that they block. One of the other problems is that when the National Research Act was passed in 1974, most research, there was much less research than there was now. The budget of NIH has gone up many times, I guess about 35 times since 1974. It's just zoomed. We've not kept up. As science has advanced, we've not kept up in our understanding of the ethical, legal, and social and cultural issues involved. In 1974, most research was done by a doctor in his clinic, usually his. So he would take the patients he's known for many years, he would say, here's a new treatment I want to try, and he would try it. Now, to get research done, to get FDA approval on a new drug, you need to go to 60 hospitals to get 3,000 patients. So you have 50, 60 hospitals, and you have 50, 60 different committees. And one committee will say, this project looks fine, one says, no way, one says, change this, one says, change that. And so these committees have gotten in the way of doing a lot of science.
Do they have that much influence?
They do, yes.
Yes.
So President Obama in 2011 released proposals for changing the system of oversight and changing these committees. The backstory there is that Rahm Emanuel, who is now the mayor of Chicago, has a brother named Ezekiel Emanuel, who's an oncologist who works in bioethics. So he then said to Obama, look, we need to change these committees. So those proposals came out in 2011. Nothing's really happened with them yet. So there's a lot of stuff going on in terms of policy. But the broader issues is, and the reason this is important, is because there are major issues that we all face as a country. Should there be limits on what scientists do? And if so, where should the limits be? And who should decide? So if I say, here's a new drug, and I think it's going to help people, is it too risky? Is it not risky enough? How much informed consent is enough? We have, if someone goes into a study in a hospital now, the informed consent is often 45 pages, 50 pages, filled with dense legalese, and people don't understand it. And more broadly, I would say that what I learned from doing this is that these committees are a prism through which to look at a whole range of issues that we face today that are important issues about science and ethics. So to give you an example, every week we all scroll down and click I accept online, right? Now notice it doesn't say read and agree. It says scroll down. They don't even want you to read it, but those are legal documents. But so we're all agreeing to things that we don't understand. So informed consent, legalese has taken over the things we do, our transactions. And I think this is a major problem. I think that just as informed consent is not understood by patients and studies, so too we all sign informed consents every time we go on Google or whatever, Facebook or Amazon, et cetera. And I think this is a major problem. I think that policy-wise, there should be a policy, since the internet is basically a public utility at this point. To interact with government, we have to use, even if you want to contact the IRS or New York City government, you have to have internet access. There should be a law. We should not be forced as consumers to agree to contracts that we don't understand.
Well, then what should be the role of the IRB? I mean,
so IRBs need to just go over these forms. We need to rethink the system. We need to make sure that informed consent forms are understood by patients, for instance, that there could be interactive network systems where it could say, you know, this study will look at your DNA. Click here if you don't understand DNA, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we need to think creatively about that. I've recently been interviewing research ethics committees in the developing world. And they say sometimes it takes 2 days to get informed consent from someone. Whereas here, another study I did, some patients told me they were consented when they were in the gurney about to go into the operating room. They were told, by the way, here's a study, you know, blah, 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 just sign here. And, you know, they didn't understand it. And there are many examples of scandals that have recently happened by people entering studies and not understanding them.
just you brought up developing countries. So what are some of the challenges that you face? I mean, because drug companies often support it and the NGOs,
Right.
you know,
Right.
want the money and they really aren't that concerned. Maybe you could elaborate
Right.
a little bit.
So this is a big problem. So most biomedical research today is funded by entities in the U.S. Most of though is funded not by the National Institutes of Health or by government, but it's funded by industry, by pharma, by the pharmaceutical industry. And most of that is done in the developing world. So most drug company studies now are not done in New York or New Jersey. They're done in India, China, Vietnam, Peru, et cetera. Think about it, just as our cell phones are not made here, they're made in India or Vietnam, so too medical research has been put offshore. It's much cheaper and there's much less regulation. If I'm a drug company, to do a complicated study, it's cheaper to do it in Peru than it is to do it in Peoria or New York. But as a result, there are problems. So you often have illiterate population. Some people work where their language was never a written language, for instance. In Xhosa, which is one of the major languages in South Africa, there's a word for cure. That's the only word. There's no word for treatment, for experimental treatment. So if you say, I'm going to give you this drug, the only word for drug is the word for cure. So if you say to someone, I'm going to give you this drug, it's an experimental drug, we don't know if it's going to work, what they hear is you're giving me the cure, for example. One other scandal, for instance, is Pfizer was involved in a drug for meningitis, a brain infection in Nigeria with children, and a number of children died. And so the government of Nigeria decided to sue Pfizer. And there was the Attorney General in Nigeria was leading the effort. And when WikiLeaks occurred a few years ago with Julian Assange, one of the things that came out was that Pfizer decided to go after the Attorney General and was getting the State Department involved to try to smear the Attorney General, that they were trying to dig up dirt on him, make up stuff, put it in the newspapers to embarrass him because he was going after Pfizer because these kids had died. So again, these are major problems. But these are difficult problems. So some of these are. So when I interviewed people in the developing world about what the major ethical problems they face are in these committees, these research ethics committees, the number one problem, which surprised me, was money. And people said, if you pay people $500 or $1,000 to be in a study in the US, if you give people here $1,000, that's a year of salary, and you'll be coercing people. They'll be entering the study for the wrong reasons. But if we let you have our people cheap, we're letting you exploit our people. We're giving you our people cheap. So what do?
But in the end, how do you balance research and clinical care? I mean, is there an easy way to do this with oversight or not oversight?
Yeah, so there needs, so the problem is that the way the system's set up now, it's thought these are easy questions. Some of these are difficult questions. Ethics is not always a straightforward, there's not always a straightforward, easy answer. You need people to discuss it. And we need to pay more attention to these issues, I think. Some of these issues, there's not consensus. We need to get consensus. I think you want to promote science, but you want to protect people's rights and not do experiments that they don't know about, not have companies take advantage of them. And so I think that IRBs, for instance, look at the committees, don't take into account, or up until recently, when they were formed in the 70s, they didn't take into account whether or not the researcher was making money from a drug company off of the patients. And it wasn't until in 1999, there was a patient named Jesse Gelsinger at the University of Pennsylvania who was a healthy young man who volunteered to be in a study and died in the study. And it was a gene transfer experiment. And the researcher knew there were problems with this. Jesse was the second patient. The researcher knew that there were problems with the first patient, but he pushed Jesse into the study. It turns out that he owned part of the company making the drug. And so he wanted patients in his study. So even though there were problems, he went ahead and pushed patients into a study. Well, that was approved by the IRB because the IRB at that point didn't really look at issues of conflicts of interest. And so it's an evolving system. So the point is that there are ways that we could do this, but we need to pay attention to it. The problem is these committees operate behind closed doors. They generally refuse to be studied. So they don't want people coming in and observing them, how they make decisions, et cetera, and that's been a problem. Science is giving us more and more challenges. We're living in a golden age of science in many ways, right? If you think how far we've come in the past 50 years with technology, with the internet, with having cell phones, with biology, with understanding genetics, it's extraordinary. But we've not kept up with people understanding the science, people understanding the ethical issues, the legal issues, et cetera.
Gilead Sciences, as you know, developed a Hep C, apparently very effective drug, and the cost of a single treatment, I think I read, was $80,000 to $100,000. Now they have a monopoly for the time being. But what are your views on the intersection of medical capitalism, which permits the development of those drugs, and what should be, if any, regulation of pricing in that kind of a situation, which basically prices most patients out of the market?
Right. So the issue is for Hep C, there was a new drug introduced last year, and it cost about $80,000 a patient per year. So I think that's immoral. I think that's ridiculous. And at first it was higher. It's only because another company came along and said, well, we're only going to charge I think they wanted $100,000 or $120,000. Another company came along and said, we're going to do ours for $60,000 or something like that. Then the company came down and said, okay, it'll be $80,000. So I think that's ridiculous. The issue is that I think drug companies and insurance companies have sort of bought out the political process in a way. I mean, I think that's one of the problems, right? So it ends up being our tax dollars that end up covering people with Medicaid and Medicare often, who are then being charged $80,000. So it ends up being us who pay. Drug companies argue that they need the money for research and development. It turns out drug companies spend much more money on marketing than they do on research and development. So we all see these ads on TV, right? Take XYZ drug. Those are expensive. And so I think that the system's screwy. I interviewed IRB chairs at a number of universities who said, our researchers are not getting government grants like they used to. They're not getting NIH grants because they're harder. They want to do industry grants. And the industry grants often are for, quote, Me Too drugs. So a drug company will have a patent on, say, this is the drug. Now they'll and the patent's it's going to go off patent. So the company will make a little tweak in the drug and say, this is the new drug. We want to extend the patent on this. So the researchers will take patients who are doing well on their current drug, switch them to the new drug, right, to see how well it works. And the institution gets a couple $1 million. So this is helping the company. It's not, the primary purpose is not to help patients. But this is the kind of problem that if only universities got a few million dollars of research money to do something that actually has more public health benefit, I think it would be great.
Big Pharma has a difficult time enrolling minority patients and participants into their studies. a lot of it has to do with the history of Tuskegee and Johns Hopkins and a general distrust of the whole research process. And without being coercive and ensuring that there's truly informed consent, how can we, any ideas on how we can increase the numbers of participants in pharmaceutical studies? Because without increasing the numbers of minorities in pharmaceutical studies, we don't know how those studies will affect minority patients.
Right. Terrific question, extremely important issue. So I think there needs to be more trust built, or the distrust that's been there needs to be overcome. And I think that takes time and work. I think for medical institutions as a whole, often there's a lot of distrust of, on the part of minority populations looking at medical institutions that often have not had the interests of minority populations as high on their priorities as they should. So I think to show, look, these are beneficial, I think that people are educatable. If you say, look, clearly these are the benefits, I think you can, instruct people or inspire people to see that and try to overcome the distrust that's been there. And the problem is there's been distrust. The study that he mentions at Hopkins, there was the Kennedy-Krieger study, I think is probably with the lead paint. So it was known that kids who eat lead paint get neurologic problems. So Hopkins did a study. They wanted to get rid of the lead paint in homes and see that it decreased the number of neurologic problems. And what they did was they said, well, to completely abate the lead was going to cost this much money. So why don't we do 2 lesser levels where we'll leave some of the lead there and we'll just get rid of some of the lead. And they put kids and families into these different homes, and some of the kids ended up with neurologic problems. And of course, if they had said we're just going to get rid of all the lead, in other words, so they knew lead was a problem, and they put kids in the homes that still had lead, which is part of what fueled the mistrust. I think they didn't think through how would an outsider look at the ethical issues involved with this. So I think pharma needs to do a better job being as ethical as they could be. And I think also, and other medical institutions too, need to really show how they do have the best interests of patients at heart.
Many years ago, early 70s, I was head librarian for Pfizer research, back when Pfizer was run by scientists, not by accountants. And I got a phone call from the president's office. President Laubach was requested in a couple of weeks to testify before Senator Kennedy's subcommittee on the ethics of testing drugs on prison inmates. A practice that was ended soon afterward, mostly because of concern was, what did informed consent mean when you were incarcerated without your consent? But the data was fascinating, which was that people who volunteered for those trials had a dramatically lower recidivism rate when they got out of jail. And now it might, the first thing you learn in Statistics 101 is correlation is not causation. It might be just because people with a social conscience are more likely to volunteer for drug trials and less likely to be repeat offenders when they get out. But the difference was so dramatic that most people suspected that there was, in addition to new information being generated, a really societally beneficial role for testing drugs on prison inmates. And so my question is that possibility being reinvestigated at all? And how might it be handled if that were to be reintroduced?
Well, it's a complicated question. So the problem is that for a number of years, there were some very unethical studies that were conducted on, quote, inmate populations. So at the Willowbrook School, for instance, they did experiments on people to try to give them hepatitis, for instance, as I recall. And the people were there, they are in the institution, let's just experiment on them. Same, there was a Jewish Home for the Aged, and there were experiments, as I recall, if I recall correctly, that were done there because they're there, they're not going to leave, we'll just do experiments on them. They don't understand it, it's okay, it's for their good. So because there were violations ethically like that, there became stiffer guidelines for doing research on prisoners. You can do research on prisoners, but there need to be a few things. One, it has to be something that's going to benefit the prisoners, right, or the prison population. So the problem is you don't want research that they're a useful population, because after all, that's sort of what the Nazis did, right? Here's a population of people, let's just experiment on them. They can't really say no, they're just here. So they can't give full informed consent. So I would argue, though, that as a result of these higher regulations, so you can do it, but they're higher regulations. The higher regulations are various, you need a prison representative, et cetera. But as a result, we know much less about prisoners than we should. So there needs to be a better balance. So I think you don't want just research being done on them because, hey, it's convenient, they're there and they have to do it, and they may think that they'll get them out early, et cetera. I think the reason that prisoners who volunteered for research had less recidivism, as you say, could be because of either one, maybe they're, as you say, more, I think you didn't use the word altruistic, but they're more socially minded, I think is what you said. Second, maybe they're better educated. For instance, we know that better educated people are more likely to participate in studies, for instance, or it seems that way often. And so maybe they're better educated, therefore they're going to be in studies and they may get out. And of course, you'd also want to look at studies of what? I mean, was it for mental illness? Was it for cancer? Was it psychosocial things? So I think you're right that we've moved, because of excesses, we've developed a lot of guidelines that may now be too restrictive. But getting the right balance is what we need to do.
Well, thank you once again. I mean, advancing science and protecting humans is a big challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.